The Flight of the Phoenix was not just Robert Aldrich's most commercially unjust failure. It was a $5,800,000 survival film that killed its own stunt pilot on a protection shot that was not even needed. The first take already had the footage, while the cameras kept rolling and captured every second of the crash on film, and that was built around the most precisely engineered biographical convergence in Hollywood history. A brigadier general in the United States Air Force Reserve, playing a pilot struggling to survive in the desert, a German actor who had been sentenced to death by the Schutzstaffel for refusing to shoot American prisoners playing a German who holds the group's fate in his hands, and a British novelist who had served as a Royal Air Force flight engineer for 6 years, writing the story that put all of them there. We are digging into the wreckage of the Flight of the Phoenix with 20 dark secrets the studio tried to bury. Secrets locked inside Federal Aviation Administration accident reports, production correspondence, military biographical records, and the kind of actor autobiographies that only become fully legible once you understand what every principal was actually carrying onto that desert set. The Phoenix of Greek mythology burns and is reborn from its own ashes, a symbol so embedded in the cultural imagination that its deployment as a film title carried automatic freight about death, transformation, and resurrection. What Aldrich and Heller understood was that the Phoenix mythology operated simultaneously as the film's plot mechanics and as its moral argument. The aircraft rising from the wreckage is not merely a survival device. It is a demonstration that human ingenuity, applied with sufficient desperation, can reverse an apparently irreversible catastrophe. The film's title is its thesis. Its thesis is a rebuke to despair. What made this argument more dangerous than the marketing materials suggested was the specific condition under which the Phoenix is reborn. It must first be completely destroyed. The men in the Sahara do not build from abundant resources. They build from the wreckage of the disaster that has already consumed them. The mythology is not a comfort, it is an instruction. You cannot rebuild what you have not yet lost. Robert Aldrich arrived at the Flight of the Phoenix carrying the weight of a director who had spent $10 million of his own money building Aldrich Studios, the independent production facility constructed to give himself the institutional freedom studio contracts denied, only to watch that investment hemorrhage through underperforming productions. The Flight of the Phoenix, produced through his associates and Aldrich Company with 20th Century Fox, was not merely a creative interest. It was a commercial necessity. A director making a film about men who must rebuild something from the ruins of catastrophe was making, in the most precise biographical sense, a film about his own situation. He stated plainly that the film previewed well, and everyone thought it was going to be a big hit. It was not. It earned less than half of its break-even threshold. The studio Aldrich had built ultimately had to be sold. The Phoenix did not fly for him. Trevor Smith, born Trevor Dudley Smith in Bromley, Kent, in 1920, raised by two alcoholic parents, beaten weekly at prep school for inadequate Latin, apprenticed as a racing driver before the war interrupted everything, served as a Royal Air Force flight engineer from 1940 to 1946, 6 years. He understood aircraft from the inside, the mechanical systems, the structural tolerances, the specific ways components could be cannibalized and recombined under field conditions. When he wrote The Flight of the Phoenix in 1964, the technical authority of the aircraft construction sequences was not research, it was memory. He subsequently moved to Phoenix, Arizona, the biographical alignment between the city's name and his novel's central metaphor going entirely unacknowledged in every interview he gave, and eventually died of cancer there in 1995. He dictated the final chapters of his last novel from his deathbed and died 3 days after its completion. The man who had written the most famous fictional act of desert survival died in a desert city whose name was his novel's symbol, working to the last possible moment. From the beginning of pre-production, Frank Tallman was assigned to fly the Paul Mantz Phoenix P-1, purpose-built for the film's aerial sequences. Designed by Otto Timm, certified airworthy by the Federal Aviation Administration on June 14, 1965. Tallman was the senior partner, the more current pilot, the man whose expertise had shaped the P-1's design throughout construction. On May 8, 1965, 6 weeks before the scheduled flying sequences, Tallman shattered his kneecap in a go-kart accident with his young son. He was hospitalized and unable to fly. His partner, Paul Mantz, 61 years old, stepped in. Mantz had flown in over 250 films. He had helped plan Amelia Earhart's final round-the-world attempt. He had told reporters he was trying to wean himself away from this kind of work, that his ears rang constantly from power dives. He had privately admitted to his crew that the P-1's control forces were so heavy that if he took his hands off the stick, the nose would drop sharply. A go-kart accident with a child had sent the most famous movie pilot in Hollywood history to his death in an Arizona desert. But the real problem was not the accident that put him there. It was the decision made on the day that killed him. The precise sequence of events on the morning of July 8th, 1965, at Buttercup Valley is documented in the Federal Aviation Administration accident report and the testimony of witnesses. Mantz flew the Tallman's Phoenix P-1 on the first take, performing the touch-and-go maneuver the script required. Wheels skimming the ground, then throttle up and climb. The first take was clean. The necessary footage was captured. Second Unit Director Oscar Rudolph, applying the entirely normal professional practice of requesting an additional take as insurance, asked for one more pass. Mantz made the second pass. The landing skid struck a small sandy hump of sun, baked earth at approximately 90 miles per hour. The drag overstressed the aircraft's cobbled boom structure. The P-1 broke apart, the nose cartwheeled, and Mantz was killed instantly. Bobby Rose was thrown clear with a broken pelvis and shoulder. The cameras never stopped rolling. The footage from the first take amounts to 18 seconds in the finished film. The crash itself amounts to approximately 3 seconds of film available online, examinable frame by frame. A man died for footage that was not needed on a day when the needed footage already existed, because normal production practice was applied to an aircraft whose structural margins did not accommodate it. James Stewart arrived on the Imperial Valley Desert, set in April 1965, as a Brigadier General of the United States Air Force Reserve, the highest-ranking actor in American military history. Having risen from private to full colonel in less than 4 years of wartime service, he had flown 20 combat missions over Germany in B-24 Liberators, commanding formations of up to 150 aircraft on raids to Berlin, Brunswick, Schweinfurt, and Frankfurt. He had personally written condolence letters to the families of pilots under his command who died. He had never publicly discussed any of this in detail. His performance as Frank Towns, the pilot who has lost 2 men through what he believes was his own error, who sits in the desert processing guilt while a German engineer leads the rebuilding effort, is the performance of a man who understands from experience what it means to be responsible for lives that end on your command. 1 month after the film's December 1965 release, Stewart flew as a non-duty observer in a B-52 on an arc light bombing mission over Vietnam. His son Ronald was killed in Vietnam the same year. The man playing a fictional pilot stranded in the Sahara was simultaneously the only actor in Hollywood history who had commanded real bombing raids over Germany and would shortly observe real bombing raids over Vietnam. His character's guilt was performed by the only man on the set who knew, from the inside, what that particular guilt actually cost. Hardy Krüger's presence as Heinrich Dorfman carries a biographical charge that transforms the role from a dramatically convenient character into a precise historical statement. Kruger was born in Berlin in 1928 to ardent Nazis, educated at the Adolf Hitler Schule at Ordensburg-Sonthofen, and made his film debut in a Nazi propaganda film at 15. In March 1945, assigned to the 38th Schutzstaffel Grenadier Division Nibelungen, he refused an order to shoot captured American soldiers. He was sentenced to death for cowardice. A higher-ranking Schutzstaffel officer countermanded the order. He subsequently escaped, hid in the Tyrol until the war ended, was captured by American forces, and spent time as a prisoner of war. He later told interviewers that war films were boring and should not be made, his own experiences having provided enough trauma. During the filming of A Bridge Too Far in 1977, where he played a Nazi general, he wore a topcoat over his Schutzstaffel uniform between takes, so as, in his words, not to remind myself of my childhood in Germany during the war. The man playing the cold, efficient German engineer in The Flight of the Phoenix had been sentenced to death at 16 for the specific act of refusing to kill Americans. The film put him in a desert with an American cast and asked him to save their lives. The casting was not accidental. Aldrich knew. Bobby Rose, 64 years old, described as the dean of Hollywood stuntmen, was strapped into the cockpit behind Mantz when the P-1 broke apart. He was thrown clear with a broken pelvis and shattered shoulder. The Federal Aviation Administration investigation noted Mantz's blood alcohol level measured 0.13 in the autopsy, a finding witnesses disputed, citing the desert heat and the post-mortem biochemical processes that produce elevated ethanol readings. Whether Mantz was impaired or the measurement was an artifact remains unresolvable. What the record establishes is that the man flying was 61, coming out of semi-retirement, had acknowledged the aircraft's dangerous control characteristics, had his safety recommendations about the runway surface ignored, and died on a shot already covered. Mantz's widow filed a $150,000 civil suit against Paul Mantz Aviation almost exactly a year after his death. The Federal Aviation Administration's alcohol finding became the production's liability shield. The production's decision regarding the crash footage was documented with institutional care. Neither take appeared in the completed film. Aldrich withheld both out of respect for Mantz. The crash was captured by multiple cameras running simultaneously, processed, reviewed, and set aside, but not destroyed. Newsreel organizations obtained it and broadcast it as news footage within days. Stills were published in aviation journals. The film substituted a hastily modified North American O-47A observation plane, canopy removed, skids attached, ventral fin added, painted to resemble the P-1 for its remaining aerial sequences. The landing sequences were deleted from the script. The 18 seconds of P-1 footage from the successful first take were used. The crash footage, meanwhile, has been available for public consumption since July 1965 and remains watchable today on multiple platforms. The tribute Aldrich paid by withholding it from the film was real and immediate. Its object became irrelevant almost as soon as the newsreel cameras had the footage. But the real problem was what the final title card revealed about how the production processed what it had witnessed. The final title card reads, "It should be remembered that Paul Mantz, a fine man and a brilliant flyer, gave his life in the making of this film. It is the only moment in the film that is not fiction, not a dedication inserted by a studio with legal obligations, but a direct statement of fact placed at the conclusion of a film about men who survive against impossible odds, acknowledging that one man did not. The film ends with the Phoenix taking flight, the rebuilt aircraft rising from the desert, the men escaping, the survival mythology completing itself. And then, in the silence after that achievement, the screen informs you that someone died to make that flight visible. Every audience that has felt the cathartic release at the takeoff has then been required to hold that feeling alongside the knowledge that the takeoff killed the pilot who flew it." Aldrich placed this in the most prominent position available, and called the man a fine man and a brilliant flyer. No studio lawyer could have objected. No audience who read it has ever forgotten it. The Flight of the Phoenix belongs to a lineage of survival. Ensemble films its structure simultaneously embodied and interrogated. The most direct ancestor is Howard Hawks' Only Angels Have Wings from 1939, pilots grounded by attrition, stripped of their equipment, sustained by professional solidarity and the refusal to acknowledge despair, whose moral grammar Aldrich absorbed and then subjected to a specifically 1960s pressure. The man whose skills the modern world no longer needs, the pilot flying cargo in the wrong direction, because that is what his career has become. Towns is not Cary Grant's Jeff Carter, the mythological professional whose competence is equal to every situation. He is a cargo pilot past his peak, flying oil workers across the Sahara because better assignments no longer came. Hawks' version of this story is about the redemption of genuine competence. Aldrich's is about the survival of men who must acknowledge how far their competence has been diminished by time and must build something new from what remains. The revelation that Dorfman designs model aircraft rather than full-scale ones, that his engineering calculations were extrapolated from model design principles rather than operational specifications, functions simultaneously as horror and dark comedy. The men sustained by the belief that a professional aeronautical engineer is supervising their construction discover that his credibility was founded on a misunderstanding. What the film then does with this revelation is its most precise and most overlooked argument: the plane flies anyway. The model aircraft engineer's calculations, applied to full-scale construction under desert conditions, produce a machine that achieves flight. Expertise is more transferable than its institutional containers suggest. The principle that makes a model aircraft fly is the same principle that makes a real one fly, scaled by a factor Dorfman has calculated correctly, despite his apparent lack of qualification. The film's apparent twist about false credentials is actually an argument about the nature of competence, that the knowledge is real, even when the credentials are not what you assumed. The men who trusted a model aircraft designer with their lives were right to trust him. The universe, indifferent to their despair, vindicated the choice. The Sahara in the Flight of the Phoenix was the Algodones Dunes, and pilot Knob Mesa in California's Imperial Valley, near Yuma, Arizona. Aldrich documented that the cast went out nights in Yuma after filming, throwing prop dummies from moving vehicles at bystanders. Dark comedy responding to the psychological pressure of extreme heat, a confined location, a single dramatic situation, and the accumulated weight of Mantz's death already present in the production's memory. The Sahara was the Imperial Valley. The authenticity was approximate. The heat was entirely real. Lucas Heller, the German-born British screenwriter who had adapted Whatever Happened to Baby Jane for Aldrich, brought structural intelligence, the critical reception, consistently praised and never fully analyzed. His most significant departure from Smith's novel was deepening the Dorfman town's antagonism into a philosophical debate about authority and the right to lead under extreme conditions. In the novel, Dorfman's arrogance is dramatic furniture. In Heller's script, it is an argument. Survival requires appointing whoever has the best chance of keeping you alive, regardless of congeniality. Towns's resistance is the democratic instinct. Question authority, demand accountability, applied to a situation that the available water supply cannot support. Heller had been born in Germany, survived the war as a child, and spent his adult career writing about the failure of authority. The Flight of the Phoenix is the most optimistic film he ever wrote, carrying the specific optimism of a man who had survived a war. The knowledge that the right person, given sufficient latitude, can save you. Ian Bannon's Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor as Crow. The sardonic Scottish soldier whose running commentary serves simultaneously as the film's comic relief and its most honest moral voice was one of 5 nominations The Flight of the Phoenix received. Bannon lost to Martin Balsam for 1,000 Clowns. What the nomination category rarely produces is what Bannon's performance accomplishes. It changes the moral valence of every scene it enters. Crow's function is not to survive the desert, but to describe it honestly, to articulate, with the economy of a man who has spent a military career stripping comfort from institutional situations, exactly what the group's condition requires of them. His nomination was the right response to the right performance. His loss was the standard outcome for right responses in the wrong year. He remained, for the rest of his career, the actor that people who actually knew films knew about, consistently underestimated by everyone else. Aldrich's documented bewilderment at the film's commercial failure is one of the more precisely stated examples of Hollywood's inability to predict its own audience. He stated flatly that the film previewed well, that everyone thought it was going to be a big hit, and that it never took off. Fox's records established the parameters. The film needed $10,800,000 in domestic rentals to break even, and earned $4,855,000. It lost just over $5 million. The critical reception was not the explanation. Variety called it superlative. The cast was not the explanation. Stewart, Attenborough, Finch, Borgnine, Kennedy, Kruger, and Bannon represented one of the most concentrated collections of genuine talent assembled for a single 1960s production. The story was not the explanation. Survival narratives, properly constructed, are among the most commercially reliable genre forms available. The failure was, in the most precise sense, a market mystery. Aldrich never explained it satisfactorily. The film ran in selected theaters from December 1965, achieved a full release in 1966, earned half its costs, and quietly became the best film of its year that nobody saw. In 2004, John Moore directed a remake starring Dennis Quaid in the Stewart role and Giovanni Ribisi in the Kruger role, produced at $40 million, and received with a critical consensus so precisely aligned against it that its 20% Rotten Tomatoes score functions as an inadvertent tribute to the original. The 2004 version is not incompetent. It is a film that replaced everything interesting about the original: the biographical weight of the cast, the moral complexity of the script, the tension between authority and expertise, with kinetic spectacle and simplified characterization. The Ribisi Dorfman is a grotesque rather than an argument. The Quaid Towns is an action hero rather than a man processing guilt. The film most closely resembles a reading of the original's plot summary, from which someone concluded the plot was the point. The remake's failure confirmed, retroactively, what the original's failure had obscured. The 1965 film's commercial difficulties were not evidence of a flawed product. They were evidence of an audience that had not yet developed the vocabulary to receive what Aldrich had made. Bosley Crowther of the New York Times called the film grim and implausible, a verdict whose first adjective was accurate and whose second was not. Implausible is the wrong word for a film whose central engineering concept was credible enough that the production built a real Federal Aviation Administration certified aircraft to demonstrate it. The film is grim with intention. In the specific way, survival narratives are grim. Because survival is not comfortable, because the desert does not care, because the men who complete the Phoenix are diminished by the process. Variety, applying the better standard, called it often fascinating and superlative. Standout performances. A producer-director at his best. The two reviews define the spectrum available in December 1965, and the spectrum tells you precisely what Aldrich had made: a film serious enough to generate genuine disagreement rather than polite consensus. The film Crowther found implausible was the one that killed a real pilot building a real plane. The only implausible element was the credit at the end, which was a fact. The 60 years since the film's commercial failure have produced something that commercial failure rarely generates. A film that has strengthened rather than faded, whose reputation has accumulated rather than eroded. The survival narrative Aldrich and Heller constructed, men who must rebuild not merely an aircraft but their own authority structures, their willingness to follow the person most qualified to lead them, regardless of personal preference, has aged into a description of the permanent human condition rather than a period adventure. The desert does not change. The water supply does not change. The question of who has the knowledge required to keep you alive, and whether you are prepared to follow them, has not changed. What has changed is the willingness to acknowledge that competence and congeniality are unrelated properties, that survival requires the humility to be saved by someone you find difficult. The film understood this in 1965. It took 60 years for the culture to stop calling that understanding implausible. The film that survived, made at personal financial cost, killing its own stunt pilot on an unnecessary protection shot, starring a brigadier general and a former Schutzstaffel deserter, and a British Royal Air Force engineer's novel, losing $5 million at the box office, nominated for 5 Academy Awards and winning none, is one of the most precisely engineered productions in the history of Hollywood survival cinema. Aldrich built a studio and watched it fail. He built a phoenix and watched it fly commercially into nothing. Paul Mantz is named in the credits and buried in California. Frank Tallman, the partner whose go-kart accident sent Mantz to the desert, died in his own aviation accident 13 years later. And Hardy Krüger, raised to love Hitler, sentenced to death for refusing to kill Americans, played the German who saved them all in a film that nobody saw and was nominated for nothing. But here's the question that the flight of the Phoenix leaves embedded in that final title card, in the name of the man who gave his life so you could watch the plane take off. If the most honest film about survival ever made by Hollywood, honest enough to kill its own stunt pilot and name him in the credits, honest enough to cast a former Schutzstaffel deserter as its salvation figure, honest enough to make its pilot a brigadier general processing real guilt, failed commercially in 1965, was remade badly in 2004, and is now considered one of the finest American films of its decade, then what does that tell you about the relationship between commercial failure and lasting value? And if the answer is that the films most worth preserving are often the ones the market most completely rejected, which films from this decade are being buried right now by the same audience indifference, waiting for 60 years of vocabulary to make them legible? Leave that in the comments. If this investigation changed how you see The Flight of the Phoenix, leave a like, because there are 1,000 films with buried secrets that deserve the same forensic attention, and the algorithm needs to know this kind of digging matters.